It really is such a pleasure to be with you to open our symposium on the role of faculty engagement and liberal education in response to student activism with Gail Christopher from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We're honored to work with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation around truth, racial healing, and transformation, and so deeply grateful for their support in sponsoring this forum and the latest edition of Liberal Education, which showcases our partnership and recognizes that higher education must play a leadership role in championing racial and social justice. We're also extremely proud to have the support of the Newman's Own Foundation and to work with colleges and universities across the country on truth, racial healing, and transformation as part of this expanded partnership. Paul Newman was a proud graduate of Kenyon College and a lifelong advocate of liberal education and inclusive excellence. And we are so thrilled to be able to carry out his legacy and his commitment to racial and social justice. My first experience as a faculty member being asked by students to play a leadership role in their protest movements was in 1998, when I was chair of the philosophy department at the University of Rhode Island. There was a series of campus protests related to allegations of racism under the guise of free speech, ultimately leading to a takeover of the Taft administration building. The protests were sparked by an incident that occurred just before the December final exam period, when the student newspaper, The Good 5 Cent Cigar, ran a nationally syndicated editorial cartoon as a filler. Appearing without commentary, the cartoon depicted a black man carrying books attempting to enter a classroom. The white professor standing behind a podium bearing the words UT Law School calls out, "If you're the janitor, please wait until after class to empty the trash. If you're one of our minority students, welcome." 2 days after the appearance of the cartoon, student protesters from a black activist group called the Brothers United circulated a list of demands that included, quote, "a new campus newspaper that reflects a campus-wide commitment to ending racism, sexism, and homophobia, and promotes a vision of cultural empathy and understanding." The managing editor of the paper responded by defending his selection and publication of the cartoon, maintaining that he, quote, "felt the cartoon was clearly a worthwhile commentary in favor of affirmative action and minority rights." He attributed anger over its content to confusion due to the lack of familiarity with the 1996 Hopwood versus Texas decision, in which 4 white students who were rejected from the law school successfully challenged the institution's affirmative action policy in admission on the grounds of equal protection. In the wake of that opinion, both UT President Robert Berdahl and System Chancellor William Cunningham spoke out against the court's decision, with Berdahl predicting the virtual resegregation of higher education. At the time, I happened to be teaching a mixed undergraduate level course entitled Race, Gender, and the Law, and my students were intimately acquainted with every aspect of the Hopwood case. Yet many of them were either directly involved in the Brothers United protests or agreed with those who read the cartoon as conveying the message that students of color were neither welcome on campus nor deserving of a university education. They cited the lack of accompanying commentary and the timing of the cartoon's publication, a full year after the circuit court's decision, as evidence in support of their view. The editor's rejoinder was, quote, "This is always a timely issue. It's not like the Texas courts did something, made a decision, and it went away. The repercussions continue." Reacting to the concerns, the Cigar ran the cartoon again, this time with an editorial response to protests, explaining the intention of the satirical cartoon was to show support for affirmative action. Protesters were not satisfied, and the Student Senate Executive Committee proposed a resolution calling for a formal apology by the editors. This coincided with a freeze by the Student Senate on funds allocated to the paper pending an investigation of their finances. Sounds familiar to many of you, I'm sure. While the Senate leaders disavowed any connection between the funding freeze and the protests, the newspaper staff regarded the action as not only retributive, but also a violation of their First Amendment rights. A number of open forums were held across campus, facilitated by faculty in journalism, philosophy, sociology, and politics, centering on the question of who gets to decide what constitutes racial offense and the circumstances, if any, whereby offense can serve as a legitimate liberty-limiting principle within the context of college campuses committed to the free exchange of ideas and to safeguarding equality of educational opportunity. 2 faculty colleagues and I received funding under the Hewlett Foundation to establish a multicultural faculty fellows program and to bring discussions about race to communities throughout the state. We went to libraries and churches to facilitate conversations around Toy Derricott's The Black Notebooks, Jonathan Kozol's Amazing Grace, Anthony Appiah's Cosmopolitanism, and Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, among other works. We then invited community members to meet with the authors on campus with students to develop action plans. Among these was to have a scholar activist in residence, and we were privileged to have Dr. Bernard Lafayette join the faculty. Doc had been senior advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and on the morning of Dr. King's assassination, Doc had promised his mentor that he would be the national coordinator of the Poor People's Campaign to address issues of social and economic injustice and to assist Dr. King in carrying his message throughout the world. It was on one of these international missions in Medellin, Colombia, that I came to fully understand the profound impact of nonviolent protest and student activism and the influence on society. 4 years earlier, Doc had been captured and detained by guerrillas after co-leading a 120-mile peace march to an embattled village with Governor Guillermo Gaviria and a priest, both of whom were murdered by their captors. Indeed, at the time, Colombia was the murder and kidnap capital of the world, with the state of Antioquia alone, where we were working, reporting more than 500 murders a month. When asked by the press upon his release why he would put himself in such danger, Doc said, "Most people think of nonviolence as passive. Nonviolence is just the opposite. It's very active. We can't simply be concerned about what would happen to us if we went to Colombia. We have to be concerned about what would happen to the Colombian people if we didn't go." Doc was practicing what Dr. King referred to in his final sermon as the capacity for dangerous altruism. In analyzing the parable of the Good Samaritan, he insisted, the real question of life is whether an individual is able to say, I do this not because of what it means to me, but because of what it will mean to my brother if I fail to do it. Thus, 4 years later, we were back again at the invitation of the state of Antioquia to establish a Center for Nonviolence at the University of Medellin and to expand Doc's work training inmates and taxicab drivers to use nonviolent tactics to achieve their goals. Shortly after we arrived in Medellin at 2 a.m., I awakened to what sounded like a train rushing through the hotel room. A few seconds later, I realized that we were in the midst of an earthquake. When I asked Doc about the experience over breakfast the next morning, he revealed that his world had been shaken to the core in another sense that night, for he had just received word that his biographer, David Halberstam, had been killed in a car accident in California. Halberstam had chronicled the lives of Doc and 7 other student leaders of the civil rights movement in his book, The Children. James Lawson, a former student of Gandhi and an admirer of King, undertook a mission to introduce the philosophy of Christian love and the principles of nonviolent social change to this group of youth in Nashville. Halberstam was a journalist for the Nashville Tennessean at the time and witnessed as these 8 young people endured beatings at lunch counters, faced police wagons and jail, and fled burning buses and death threats throughout their quest for justice in the sit-ins and the freedom rides. Doc was beaten and arrested 27 times during the struggle, but never once wavered from his deep and abiding commitment to nonviolence. Nevertheless, at the start, he worried about whether he'd be able to resist violence, especially in the midst of women and girls being brutalized. As a young man, he was particularly concerned about being viewed as a coward by the people attacking him. Halberstam recounts the day that Doc's fear disappeared. Quote, Lafayette was in a group of students walking from the First Baptist Church to the lunch counters, and he was near the end of the line, about 3 or 4 people from the end. Suddenly, a group of white toughs charged from the end of the line and attacked one of his colleagues, Solomon Gort. The whites had knocked him down and were kicking him. Bernard moved as quickly as he could to get back and protect Solomon, to put his body down on Gort's as they had been taught. That would make them switch their attention from Solomon to him, and they did, beating him and kicking him instead. Just then, Jim Lawson walked over. The leader of the whites was sporting the prevailing uniform of the day. When he saw Lawson's coolness, he spat at him. Lawson looked at him and asked him for a handkerchief. Lawson wiped the spit off his face as calmly as he could. Then he looked at the man's jacket and started talking to him. Amazingly, Bernard thought, these 2 men were talking about the level of horsepower in motorcycles when a few seconds earlier they had seemed to be sworn enemies. Through nonviolence, Lawson had forced his attacker to view him as a fellow human being. For Doc, the lesson became obvious. It doesn't matter what the other person thinks of you. It matters only that you do the right thing, to follow your conscience. One of the other members of the Nashville activists that Halberstam writes about is Gloria Johnson Powell, the first African-American woman to achieve tenure at the Harvard Medical School. Gloria was a student at the Meharry Medical College at that time in Nashville, after just having graduated from Mount Holyoke. Gloria was raised by her mother, who was the oldest daughter of a sharecropper in rural Virginia. Her mother came to the North and worked as a maid for a Harvard professor. She became friends with the daughter of her employer, who was her age, and when asked to accompany the family on a trip to visit the Seven Sisters, a group of elite women's colleges, she eagerly agreed. While Gloria's mother knew that she would not be able to attend college, she hoped that she would one day have a daughter who would. Gloria remembered the day that she came home from classes her senior year at the girls' Latin school in Boston to find her mother crying at the kitchen table. She was certain someone had died. Instead, her mother was crying tears of joy and handed her an acceptance letter from Mount Holyoke, notifying her that she had received a full 4-year scholarship to attend. There, she was nurtured and given the skills necessary to thrive in medical school. Gloria describes a conversation with Dr. King while at Meharry Medical College that shaped her life. She says, quote, Dr. King was in Nashville. We told him we needed to continue the freedom rides so they would know we wouldn't be deterred by violence. I told Dr. King I would leave medical school to recruit more students. Dr. King banged his hand on the table, pointed his finger at me, and said, "You will stay in school because one of these days we're going to need you." He knew and was determined I should not give up the dream. Through her work fighting infant mortality rates and promoting health in underrepresented communities, Dr. Johnson Powell continued to do the work of Dr. King by fighting for the rights of the most disenfranchised members of society. There are 2 points that I want to highlight in presenting the narratives of these remarkable individuals. First, I want to emphasize, as Halberstam did in choosing the title of his book, The Power of Youth to Transform the World. As one reviewer of Halberstam's book writes, his use of the term the children reminds us of the innocence, youthful exuberance, idealism, courage, and vulnerability of those who were willing to lead the most dangerous movement in American history. For we can see through their stories the enormous promise in student activism, social idealism, and a collective commitment to social justice and equality. Second, through word and deed, Dr. King recognized the value of an education in bringing about social change. Nearly half a century after Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize, another recipient of this award echoed his words regarding the value of education. On October 9th, 2012, while riding a bus on her way to school in the Swat Valley of Pakistan, Malala Yousafzai was shot on the left side of her forehead by members of the Taliban. Her wounds were grievous, and many thought she would die. She did not. Thanks to quick medical care and a strong will, she slowly recovered. Malala knew why she had been shot. The Taliban had targeted the 14-year-old for assassination because she spoke out when schools started to close in the Swat Valley. 5 years before, the Taliban blasted more than 400 schools in Malala's region, forcing many schools to shut their doors or go underground. Following the attacks, the Taliban issued a formal ban on education for girls, a proscription affecting more than 50,000 girls, including Malala. It was only after girls' schools began closing that Malala fully realized how important education was to her. Something had been stolen from her, she said, something that rightfully belonged to every girl. We are human beings, she acknowledges, and this is part of our human nature, that we don't learn the importance of anything until it has been snatched from our hands. When we were stopped from going to school, it was at that time that I realized education was very important. At first, Malala thought the Pakistani government would defend her right to go to school, but she realized she could not wait for politicians. As young as she was, she had to stand up for her rights. Quote, I asked myself, why am I waiting for someone else, the government, the army to help me? Why someone else? Why don't I raise my voice? She did raise her voice, and the Taliban tried to silence it with a gun. Malala realized that fear pulled the trigger. The Talib were afraid, she said, that once we were educated, we would become more powerful. She made change, and they were afraid of a 14-year-old girl, perhaps especially a 14-year-old girl. While still recovering from her wounds, Malala spoke out again, this time on her 16th birthday, to a special assembly of the United Nations. Bullets cannot silence us, she maintained. Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most important weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution. Beyond her capacity to stir our emotions, Malala's experience conveys to us the reality that there is a tendency to see morality as a private thing, the comfortable belief that goodness and good deeds characterize individual lives, not society. It compels us to consider seriously the nature of public morality, civic virtue, the nature of a good society. Malala's story reminds us that we need to do more than seek a good life. We also need to seek a good society. Our students today are doing just that. And as I argue in my current commentary in liberal education, faculty must be at the center of this work, integrating the curricular and co-curricular and identifying short and long-term strategies. In addition, administrators must ensure that the types of humanities practice required by this effort is genuinely valued and not undermined by institutional practices that prioritize publications in peer-reviewed journals above all else. Systems of reward for faculty, including the awarding of tenure and promotion, must take seriously service that involves the mentoring of students through advising, community-based learning, and participatory action planning within marginalized communities. In the process, we must reclaim our own narrative about the transformative power of liberal education as a tool for social progress and why it matters now more than ever. Far from snowflakes melting into oblivion when things heat up, this generation of students is engaged in a new era of justice-seeking activities. They want to make a difference in the world through a reinvigorated collectivity. And if we fail to help them connect their education to broader societal issues in ways that inspire them to lead change in a society still challenged by profound inequities, we abnegate our responsibilities to promote engaged citizenship, cultural empathy, pluralism, and diversity as the foundation of our nation's historic mission of educating for democracy. This is why we think it is so critical to be working right now with Gail and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation on truth, racial healing, and transformation. So it is my pleasure to introduce Gail Christopher, who's going to talk about this partnership and what we have ahead of us.
Good morning. It is such an honor and an absolute joy to be here with you today. Thank you, Lynn, for that profound walk through the power of narrative and the primacy of education as we achieve our vision and our goal. I believe that the road to victory, the pathway to victory, begins with a certain assurance, a certainty that victory will be achieved. If we don't start from a place of knowing, we might get sidetracked. We might be silenced. But if we know in our hearts that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, then we can be partners. We can reach up and we can pull that arc toward justice. Now, our challenge is to make sure that the word justice is not co-opted, it's not appropriated to mean just us. And for far too long, the political, social, economic, and indeed educational reality of this country has allowed the word justice to mean just us. Now I'm going to unpack that a little bit in my brief time with you this morning as we talk about our enterprise of truth, racial healing, and transformation. But first, I must acknowledge, and I know they're here at the conference. I'm not sure if they're here in this room right now, but we have two of our board members of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation who have joined us. Dr. Kathann Kress and Dr. Con Ned. Are you in the room, either of you? If not, I hope you will see them in the course of the few days of the conference. We are so pleased that they took the time to join this meeting and this experience, and it embodies one of the messages I have to convey. If we're going to do this difficult work, this work of truth, racial healing, and transformation, those in leadership and power in institutions must create an authorizing environment. And the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Board of Directors did that for our institution. They looked at the demographics, and they revisited the mission of our foundation. When Mr. Kellogg created the foundation, he said, do what you will with the money, so long as it helps children. He had a passion and a love for children that was born of his own life experience of loss and sacrifice. And so our foundation saw the demographic trends, recognized that most of the children born in this country today, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now, and mind you, this recognition was 10 years ago, that most of the children born in this country are children of color. And given that reality, there is an imperative and an urgency to make sure that they do not continue to be born into low-income and impoverished communities facing tremendous barriers and obstacles for the realization of their potential. And so it was almost a no-brainer for us as a foundation to make a stand fostering racial equity and racial healing. And our foundation as a whole is committed to that. And I bring you greetings on behalf of our CEO, Lejeune Montgomery Tabron. Lejeune was the first person of color hired in a professional role at our foundation, and that was almost 30 years ago. And she is now president and CEO of this organization. So what does that reveal? It reveals the long journey sometimes that it takes, and the tenacity. So we are one of the most diverse foundations in the country today, if not the most, and we are best recognized for our commitment to achieving equity and racial healing. The Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation enterprise is really the next iteration, the next phase of a decade of work and funding that I've been privileged to be a part of, to be an architect for, which we called America Healing. And what do we mean by healing when we talk about racism and division? We at the foundation mean digging in and uprooting, and I'm a Star Trek fan, so I use the term jettisoning, if you will, the core belief in a hierarchy of human value. What moves people is what they really believe in their hearts. And we have built this nation on a false taxonomy of the human family. It was embedded in our science. It was embedded in our literature. It has become embedded in every aspect of our society. And that false belief has not been addressed. We've had a civil rights movement, the likes of which the world had never seen, and it has been replicated and duplicated all over the world. We, of course, had the violence of the Civil War, with more bloodshed and loss of life than any other war we've experienced. But what neither of those or the episodic efforts that followed it have accomplished is the uprooting of the belief, the core ideology of a hierarchy of human value. And that's the work of truth, racial healing, and transformation. It has to get into the consciousness, into the perception, into the thinking. Now, it's one thing to focus on what we have to get rid of, but we really have to focus on what are we replacing that false taxonomy with. We have to replace it with an absolute understanding of our humanity, of our equal and equitable right to be fully expressed as human beings. Now, that's hard work, especially right now. It is easy to condemn the behaviors and the actions of the perceived other. It is much harder to move to understanding and genuine engagement and communication. When we conceived of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation enterprise, we had no idea our country would be where it is today. But apparently, the Native people would call them the ones above. The African people would call them our ancestors. Many of the Christians in America would call them our angels. But I don't hesitate to acknowledge that there is a transcendent force and intelligence that steps up and guides. And I am deeply moved and humbled to have been given the vision of a truth, racial healing, and transformation enterprise for this country. Because we've never done that. Although it's been done over 40 times in the world, what we call truth and reconciliation, America as a country has never stepped back and faced the truth of how we became who we are, how it is that our Congress does not reflect the diversity of this country, how it is that our institutions of higher education, the leadership, the faculty, those institutions do not adequately reflect the diversity of this country, how all of our medical professions still do not reflect the diversity of this country, how our law enforcement systems and the hierarchy therein, those systems do not reflect the diversity of this country. How did we get to be who we are? Because we held on to and embedded and institutionalized this fundamental fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. when you told the story about your college experience, and certainly the story, one of the narratives about a mother seeing her daughter be accepted at an institution of higher education. Perhaps one of my most disappointing moments in life was when I was rejected by an institution of higher education. But then, fast forward a couple of decades, and I was in a car driving my daughter to that institution where she would be enrolled. That institution happened to be Yale University. And I remember how excited I was. And there I was in the car, double parked, as all the parents were that morning, right, to unload and get her into the dormitory. And don't you know, the police officer came up to me and said, "You have to move your car." Implied, you don't belong here. Well, I had so much emotion. I was so excited for my daughter. My filters and my control was less than ideal. I jumped out of the car, and I went to the two cars in front of me and the two cars behind me, and I said, "Did he ask you to move? Did he ask you to move? Did he ask you to move?" And my poor daughter was shrinking, you know. She was like... And then I went back to him, tall. I think he was Irish, and I said, "So, since you did not ask either of them to move, I think I should stay here and let my daughter unpack." And he said, "Okay," and walked away. But my daughter, bless her heart, she said, "Mom, this is not the civil rights movement. I'm just going to college," you know. But I wanted to say to her, no, it's not just going to college. I share that story with you because I just wanted to illustrate, as Lynn did so beautifully, the first tenet of our framework for this work. And it has to do with narrative change. It has to do with the power, the absolute power of stories to shape who we are and what we believe. What we believe about ourselves and what we believe about others. And so you, as institutions of higher education, have done and can do so much to create a new narrative and to allow multiple narratives to be expressed. We're very pleased that of our over 130 partner organizations in this work, many of them represent the entertainment industry and the news industry, because we know that changing and influencing, I'm going to be blunt, eyeballs. We have to capture eyeballs, and we have to influence the images that people see. And we hope to bring members of the tech industry to the table to help us counter what has become the oxymoron of false news. If it's false, it's not news. But narrative change is a big part of the work. The second critical part of the work, which is different, is what we call racial healing. So how do we build trust and build authentic relationships and overcome our inherent automatic human biases? How do we broaden our circles of influence and expand our circle of compassion and caring? We do it through different methodologies under the rubric of racial healing. And I can say that the methodology that I have developed enables us to sit in a room with many, many people who bring different life experiences over the course of a full day or more, and listen to their narratives and their stories. And once you've heard the story of 25 people whose life experiences are different from your own, once you've listened, you are not the same. You can no longer carry the same biases that you came into the room with. But there are many approaches to this, but it is about building trust and relationships and expanding our circles of engagement. So we are asking all of the institutions that partner with us to be actively engaged in narrative change and in racial healing. And in the wonderful issue of liberal education, you have a deeper discussion of that work, and you can gain more insights from our W.K. Kellogg website. We produced an implementation guide that even offers more specific direction. But once you've engaged in what I consider the fundamental belief sort of moving, then the other aspects of the framework have to do with answering the question, continuing to answer the question, how did the belief in a hierarchy of human value become entrenched and embedded in our society? And one way we sustain that belief is through being separate from one another. We're still a very segregated country. Separation, segregation, and isolation allows us to hold on to our false perceptions and ideologies and beliefs. And so we had a team of over 30 organizational representatives from around the country coming up with a set of recommendations for how do we deal with that fundamental aspect of our society. Some people are framing this election as a divide between rural and urban, as a divide that had to do with the elite versus the unelite or the non-educated. You know, we love dichotomies, but what it really reflected was our vulnerability as a people to the power of manipulation of our deepest fears, to the power of a false representation of the way our hopes can be realized. Yes, we do have divisions in this country, but they are really not as dichotomous as they are framed. And our job in bending that moral arc of the universe toward justice, our job is to say no to false dichotomies and to emphasize that we are one human family, descendant from a common ancestry on the continent of Africa. And this notion that somehow there is less or greater value based on how we look, it's an absurd notion that has no place in the 21st century. So separation, isolation, and colonization, segregation is one aspect of the framework. It's one way collectively that we sustain the belief. But our laws and policies in this country have been designed to reinforce that fallacy. And so we had a team of experts working to make recommendations of how we revisit and transform our legal system and our policies to reflect this new understanding of who we are. And finally, the fifth piece of the framework focuses on our economy. We have designed an economy in this country, an economy of extraction and exploitation, both of the human resource and the natural resources. And that economy of extraction and exploitation is also a reflection of that hierarchy of value and that adherence to the false notion of isolation and separation. So that's the framework for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Enterprise. We at the foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, are humbled to be able to be a leader and to be a catalyst. But we are in partnership with over 130 institutions and more recently with foundations in local communities all over this country. And collectively, the reach of these partner organizations, wait for it, is almost 300 million people. Now, you saw the power of unity in the marches that happened over the last weekend on Saturday. Estimates are that it was the largest single demonstration of collective protests this nation has ever seen. It is no accident that it was organized by, for, and with, and led by women. Hello. But it wasn't just women. And the love that permeated, at least in Washington, D.C., people were caring for each other. People were demonstrating empathy and the capacity to care for one another. And just as an army has been mobilized around the concepts of xenophobia and hatred and racism, The equal and greater reaction has been a mobilization around the concepts of love and caring and unity. So I think that we're at a moment where we can really, and I'm terrible at sports metaphors, so forgive me if I get this all wrong, but I think we're at a moment where we could really move at least the ball down the field, maybe even into the end zone, if we are committed to focusing on the victory that will be ours, the victory of realizing the fundamental tenets of the Declaration of Independence, the fundamental ideals that organize this nation into one. But it is not the work of condemnation, and it is not the work of protest alone. There is a place for protest. There is a place for the visible demonstration of our unity. But there must also be the hard work in boardrooms and in classrooms and in organizations and in police departments and in hospitals and in communities all over this country, the hard work of acknowledging, yes, I have inherited a belief system that is innately biased, that does not value every human being equally. And I am willing to do the work to jettison that belief system and move forward to create a country that embraces all of our humanity. And I will not be manipulated by social media into being less than that. I will stand and I will model for my children the complexity of the democratic process. We are in an anomalous time, let's just put it that way. But we'll get through this. And perhaps we will get through it as a stronger and better America that has affirmed once and for all the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of all. Thank you. Now we are going to have questions, and do we have time? 5 minutes. Okay, so what I'll do is ask for help because the lights are kind of blinding me. So if you have a question, if you stand, and if somebody at the front table could help. Now I don't know if we have a mic for the people with questions, do we? Okay, great. So. Do we have any questions or comments?
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Noelle Chaddick from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And first, I would just like to say thank you. That was amazing. We really needed that this morning.
You're welcome. Thank
so my
you.
question is, having come up through academia, through the roots that folks of color often do, diversity, and my sense around equity and how to do the work of coalition building and collaboration, where would you tell us to look for the ways to do that across this huge gap of ideologies?
Okay. Well, you know, I don't know where this comes from. I'm terrible at sourcing, but I know there's this idea of let down your bucket where you are, that in fact, within every community, there is probably unrecognized diversity. And if you can convene a group of folks to do this work, and you look around the room and you don't see people in that room who represent that diversity, then the challenge is to expand our network. Now, from a racial standpoint, we focus on the experiences of Native American, African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, immigrants, Latino, Hispanic immigrants, Appalachian. We tried from a racial standpoint to embrace all people and their identities. And I know on your diverse campuses, those are multiple identities. And of course, we all choose to prioritize different identities at different points in our journey. But because we're focusing on our humanity and we're focusing on this absurd belief system that diminishes that humanity, it automatically casts a much broader, and I don't like the word inclusive, although it rolls off our lips because we've learned to say it, but you know, that word suggests hierarchy. It's mine and I'm including you, right? And so we're now saying expansive to reflect that we are reaching out and putting our arms around and engaging and inviting multiple perspectives. But that was a perfect question, and thank you for it. And when you look around the room, and it doesn't seem to reflect either the diversity of the community that you serve. And that's so important. Every one of your institutions is embedded in a community. Does the institution reflect the diversity of that community, both from a horizontal standpoint and a vertical standpoint? Is there another question? We might have time.
Right here. Just Ronald Crutcher from the University of Richmond, to your right side.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for the work, the great work that you're doing. I love the use of expansive over inclusive. I like that very much. My question is, I was drawn. I'm going to go to the website because I don't know a huge amount about the project other than what I've talked to folks about. I love the idea of the conversations, but on our campuses, one of my concerns is, as we try at the University of Richmond to use the rich diversity that we have there to change the culture of the institution,
right,
is technology. When I walk across campus, you know, I have to interrupt students who are doing this, and I usually say, "Hi, how are you doing?"
You're
and
so
so,
right.
I think the first step has to be getting them accustomed to just having conversation, which is what my wife, Dr. Betty Nealon Crutcher, and I do in our mentoring group. But I'd love to, because you mentioned some kind of connection to a technology industry. I just would love to hear you opine on that, if you would.
Yeah, it's a tough time. Unlike anything any of us, I don't want to age myself, but I know I never imagined that my neck muscles would be out of shape because I'm looking down at the iPhone. The iPhone's only been with us 10 years, by the way. 10 years. Now, in technology, that's a lifetime. But you are absolutely right. It is the challenge. I think part of what we have to do is create technology-free zones on campus for this work. We as human beings, our innate need for connection is hardwired. It's hardwired to be connected to another human being, to make eye contact with another human being. It's not enough to see them on a screen. It's not enough to have them as a virtual friend. We as human beings need to connect eyeball to eyeball with other human beings. We need to touch. We need to be touched. And so I think believing that and holding on to that as a fundamental principle of our continued nurturance and development of young people, I think that's one of the requirements of this work. Now, when we do the healing sessions, those are technology-free sessions. But I think, this thing has gotten ahead of us, this revolution in technology, and we are not measuring the impact that it is having on us physiologically, biochemically, and psychologically. And so I would say to institutions of higher education, step out, step up, and begin to talk about that and to intercede, because we've become addicted, obsessed with this technology. And it's important, it's valuable, it's key, but it cannot be our whole lives, and it cannot dominate our consciousness in the ways that it does, because we will pay for that. We will suffer as a consequence of that. So thank you for asking that question. And I think that may be our last question. Again, we look forward to working with each and every one of you, and I am just so honored that Lynn has had the foresight and the courage to be a real partner as we undertake this work. The foundation is in it for the long haul. They don't imagine it as a project or an initiative. That's why we call it an enterprise. We anticipate this will be decades of work, but we honestly believe it's the right work. Thank you.